My name is Grant Ingersoll. I'm a longtime Lucene and Solr committer and contributor, etc. Today I'm going to be talking about just using Lucene and Solr and LucidWorks Enterprise with e-commerce, and hopefully just give you some tips and techniques and tricks around things that I often see in various e-commerce engagements and customers I've dealt with, as well as just talk about maybe some more general things to think about, because I think one of the things that happens in e-commerce is, because at the end of the day there's always this final judgment about how often what your conversion rate is. I think e-commerce tends to do a lot of things that the rest of search users should also be doing in terms of things like analytics and stuff like that. So with that, I'm going to start off maybe with a couple of things like I just kind of think of as difference makers that I've seen in working with e-commerce. The first one is, what I like to think about is relevance matters. Okay, how many of you have done any relevance testing on your site? Okay, so a few. Shame on all the rest of you. So this little story just kind of goes like this. This was actually one of our first engagements at Lucid with a very, very, very large retailer. Very, very large retailer in the electronics firm. And one of their problems, one of the things they brought us in with, is they were using Lucene, and one of their very popular products on their online store was on page 10. Whenever you actually searched for that very specific thing by name, all of these other pieces that went along with that product all showed up sooner in the results. So if you think about how much volume this company does on a daily basis on their online store, you can imagine the amount of money that was lost by that not showing up. And so one of the things that we did was come in and by using some of the tools that I'll talk a little bit about later in terms of explaining why a certain result shows up at a certain position, we then determined that, you know what happened, they actually had some bad data. That particular product did not have its description field filled out, and that description field was one of the things that they figured was one of the most important fields to search against. So in a little less than a few hours, we had debugged that, determined that. They made the fix overnight by going back to their product data entry people and getting it fixed the next day up on the website. It was up in the, I believe it was #1 in the results. So if you don't think relevance matters, think again, put in place metrics and things like that that you can make judgments about how good your data is. And we'll talk some more a little bit later about analytics and some things that you can be doing in that space. The next case study is what I kind of categorize as the don't overthink this. Okay, I see a lot of people who spend a whole lot of time and money doing a lot of really advanced techniques, and as an engineer that stuff's all really fun. And it can be useful as well. I don't want to say don't ever do it, but in this particular case, another fairly large online retailer, in this case they don't use Lucene for this particular part of their store, but they went through and just by simply adding Autosuggest to their website, where as the user's typing, you're giving them suggestions as to what queries might be useful for them. They added millions with several zeros to their bottom line just by adding Autosuggest. So if you think about it from an engineering standpoint, how easy it is to add Autosuggest. I mean, Solr and Lucene now have a whole suggestion component, so it's pretty straightforward to add in. Of course, at that volume, there's all kinds of engineering and performance characteristics that need to be accounted for as well. But that simple fact, if that can add, something like that can add much more to your bottom line, then why not do that as opposed to spending all kinds of time on taxonomies and advanced synonym matching and NLP and things like that and user profiling. Maybe all you should really start with is something simple, and then that really leads into one of the other things I've seen is essentially think about testing all the time. Think about, especially when you're an online store, it's very easy for you to push updates, and so you can run tests all the time. A/B tests, various different relevance models, various different ways of using user profiles, things like that. This isn't a Lucene and Solr story or anything like that, but if you go and read Greg Linden's blog there, he has a really nice article about the very early days of using, implementing a recommendation system at Amazon. And it goes into, you know, essentially the story about how he was convinced that adding recommendations, which we all take for granted these days at Amazon, would really significantly add to the bottom line of Amazon's shopping experience, right? But there was this, in the story, as the story goes, there was this senior VP who was dead set against it. He thought that anything in the shopping cart experience, as people are checking out, he thought anything that would distract them from that experience would likely take them away from actually converting on the things that they had already purchased. And so what he did, and almost without permission as the story goes, went and actually still put up a test and directed some amount of traffic from the main traffic that Amazon gets to, and added this recommendation capability in. And as you can no doubt see by the way Amazon still operates with the recommendation engine, the test was quite successful. So successful, in fact, that there was no way they could not do it. It wasn't like even, you know, a few percentage points. It really blew away the things. So when you're building out your e-commerce application, think about ways that you can incorporate this kind of A/B testing and very rapid iterations around testing so that you can actually get real feedback as to what features matter. And so you can kind of tie in all of these pieces together to make for a much more effective search experience, search and navigation experience for your users and your customers. So with that, today I'm going to talk as kind of a list of topics. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools I think you have available to you here. Obviously, Lucene and Solr and LWE. And then we'll talk a little bit about users, and then just look at some of the features that are available in Lucene and Solr and LWE that make it easy for you to do some of these things. And then we'll finish up with kind of some analysis, some more thoughts around other things that you can incorporate, maybe you're not aware of in the open source space that maybe will save you a lot of time and money. Okay? How many people actually are working for real e-commerce places right now? Okay, so a good chunk, and maybe, you know, if you want to share your experiences at the end, that would be good too. So just real quickly, I mean, obviously at the Lucene layer, you've got, you know, it's a core Java APIs. Solr then builds the server on top of that, actually adds in a number of things that you want to do when it comes to searching in e-commerce. In fact, I think, you know, in particular, Solr plays very well in the e-commerce space. You see a lot of adoption of Solr because of things like faceting and the hit highlighting and the easy replication, because oftentimes in e-commerce you have very high query volume, but maybe not such high or not as large of indexes, right? So the replication model fits very well into that kind of scenario. So that might be something as well. And then I think with LucidWorks, if you go to Andre's talk later, one of the things I think that's pretty interesting is the click scoring, as well as some of the reporting features that we've added on top of Solr to make it easier for you to get the information back out to your business users, things like that. So first off, users. I think many engineers don't like users. I often ask the question, you know, how many of you are actually developers? Actually, you're writing the code. How many of you are business users, or, you know, kind of on that side? So 1, 2. All right, so of you developers, how many of you could tell me what your, or where you would even find what your top 10 queries are on your site? Okay, a couple. Some people, and how long would it take you to get that? Is this, you know, I've got to go chunk through a bunch of logs, or do I just go to an admin panel? How many of the business people could tell you that right away, right? So the thing is, right, is you need to get to know your users, because your users represent 100% of the ability for you to sell something on your e-commerce store, right? I mean, that's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I often see this all the time in the people I train and in the customers I engage with. They want to make all of these changes, to their search system because they got somebody breathing down their neck telling them that search isn't good enough. And this kind of goes back to the relevance matters question. And if you don't build in kind of these metrics right from the beginning, then you're never going to be able to make good choices as to how to fix the things that are broken in terms of your relevance. So take the time to actually get to know your users. And the way you really need to do that is start to think about how you can measure that. Talking with many search developers in e-commerce, there tends to be a really heavy focus on just conversion rates, i.e., when do people actually buy? But that may not actually be the best measure for judging search because there are so many other things that can happen in between when you actually, a user clicks on a search result and then actually ultimately goes and buys. So, you may want to think about maybe it's just the actual clicks on the documents, and we'll actually talk about some useful metrics here in a second that are, I think, pretty easy to incorporate into your site. Hopefully, if you had a chance, I think Otis's talk last night, maybe you can review the slides where he talked a lot more about search analytics. Some of those things would probably be helpful as well. One of the other things I like to think about in terms of when it comes to these users and the analytics that you're looking for is there one right answer on your site? In other words, are people typing in a specific thing and you need to take them right to that page? So in particular, like I said earlier, you had that known item, this particular product. Is that number one on your results set? Or, when they type in those keywords, should I just take them to, should I give them a smattering of results that they can then peruse through and ultimately decide on, okay? So, because you can make different tuning choices in the way you set up your queries by simply knowing whether the large majority of your queries are known item searches or whether the large majority of your keywords are, or large majority of your searches are just keyword based or topic based, okay? So for instance, I did a webinar with Sheet Music Plus, which is the world's largest online seller of sheet music, and their most common query was simply piano. So if you think about from a search perspective, what does it mean to bring relevant results for sheet music for simply the term piano? I mean, you could pick and choose as many as you wanted, but then they also had this subsection of search results where people would put in very specific, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and for guitar or whatever, I don't know, I mean, whatever the category or the specific known item was. So you had to have these different strategies for making sure you have effective relevance capabilities. So with that, some useful metrics, things that I think you can very easily incorporate into your admin tools, and so that you always, as a developer, everybody across your business is always aware of what is going on in terms of your system. Going back to the known item versus keyword, typically mean reciprocal rank, i.e. how far down the list is the actual right answer. How far down the list is that? That's essentially what mean reciprocal rank tries to calculate and gives you an average across all of the various queries that you run. Calculating that's pretty straightforward. The other one, precision at 10, that's more for the keyword-based ones, i.e. how many right answers do I have in the top 10 results, assuming you're showing 10 results at a time, which is what most people do. So you could substitute in other numbers, precision at 20, because let's face it, if it's not on the first page, you may not, users probably aren't going any deeper into the results, which actually that's another useful metric as well, is how deep do people page. So I also think, kind of the show me the money type of metrics. What are your top selling products? And then look at how well they do when you search for those things. So, and search for synonyms related to that thing. So in particular, that product I mentioned earlier, people are putting in that specific keyword and seeing how well it performs. So do that for your top products and have that as part of your displays too, your internal displays, so that you know what your money makers are doing, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're not selling enough stuff, then you're going to be in trouble job-wise and company-wise and all of that stuff. So focus on your bread and butter. That doesn't mean you should neglect the other pieces, but make sure that's a part of it. And then also you can start to get this sense of is that top products, are your top products underperforming in a search sense? So in particular, maybe you have brick and mortar stores and an online presence, right? In your brick and mortar stores, you know, this product is gangbusters, and online it's eh. So think about ways that you can, if that's a problem, there's probably something going wrong with your search, and so you need to give your business people tools that help them better make that product perform better in terms of search. Other useful ones, just, you know, that question I asked, what are your top 10 queries, top 50 queries? What are the top query terms? Zero results can be a big one as well, especially if you start to do session analysis of, you know, are people bouncing from when they get zero results, things like that. Other ones that I've seen people use effectively, average number of facets, filters, spell checks clicked per user session. That can be somewhat helpful as well. Sometimes it becomes difficult to, you know, how much can you read into these tea leaves of what users are doing, but at least with these metrics, you can start to think about, well, if I combine that with this A/B testing, I now have ways of judging what I'm doing. A few others, average number of searches per session, Autosuggest. You know, maybe if you have a high number of searches relative to the number of conversions, then maybe people aren't finding what they need, and so you might need to start to think about other ways that you can fix that. So starting to think a little bit more about what are the minimum search features. Naturally you want high quality relevance. Again, if it's not on the first page or even in the first one or two results, then you probably need to spend a lot more time on your querying capabilities. This is, you know, I think Lucene and Solr do this as well as anybody. The very high quality results. It's very easy just to out of the box get very high quality results out of Lucene and Solr. But you know, you still need to be able to test there as well. It's also, I think, very easy to have, you know, sub-second response time and all of that. So again, that's all part of that user experience. If it's taking too long, then you know, users are more likely to abandon. Nothing new there. I mean, you all know this. That's just for completeness sake. Faceting, I think, you know, in e-commerce, obviously faceting is a very important feature. Most sites these days have it. If you're not aware, though, I think Lucene and Solr and LWE have quite a bit of capabilities around faceting, or at least at the, you know, the algorithms level to do different things in terms of faceting. So, you know, the basics like field faceting. We also just added numeric range faceting to go along with date faceting, so now you can start to do like price ranges more easily than having to do facet by query all of the time. A new one, this pivot faceting, or like I sometimes like to call the what if faceting. I'm going to actually maybe pop over to the example, but you can see an example of the pivot faceting over here where, you know, it's the category electronics, and then so it shows how many facets are in the category electronics, and then if the user were to choose the category of electronics, how many of the items are in stock or how many are not. So you can start to see how you can kind of build up these pivots or these decision trees or however you want to call it. Hierarchical faceting, that's often something that people want to add in e-commerce, especially if you have your own taxonomy. Unfortunately, there's nothing what I would call native support for this, but it's actually pretty easy to model using prefixes as to the level that you're at when you do your token streams or when you do your analysis. You can essentially put, you know, if you're at the first level, you put like a special character saying this is the first level slash and then whatever the facet is, and then number, you know, like the number 2 and then a slash and whatever the facet is. And then in Solr, there's you can use this parameter called the facet prefix to basically go down and choose which level you're at. So, and if you're not aware of it also, maybe there's dynamic faceting, the notion that you're grouping on, you're creating these facets kind of on the fly based on the content that was generated. We have integrated in with Solr the Caret 2 project or the Caret Squared project. Actually, David Weiss, who is here this week, is one of the big contributors to that. So if you haven't seen Caret 2, very nice way of doing clustering or dynamic faceting on search results. That's all pretty tightly integrated into Solr. Also support single and multi-select faceting. So the multi-select is kind of like a union of your facets, so you can pick various facets from different groups, and it doesn't necessarily have to only restrict down the faceting space. It can just essentially OR them together. If you've ever been on our search website at Lucid Imagination, we have that we use it for like the projects. So like if you want to search across both the Lucene and Solr mailing list and still see the facet counts, you can do that. Another thing that I think is pretty interesting that's coming on Solr 1581 is this facet by function. So if you've never used function queries, pretty effective way to do some runtime calculations based on what you have, what's in the actual document. So then you can start to think about, essentially I could take and calculate these functions or these mathematical expressions at runtime based on my query results and then put them into different ranges, so it essentially becomes like the numeric range faceting. So that might be of interest to people as well. The other piece I don't have up on here that plays, I think, well in the e-commerce space is the stats component in Solr, which allows you to, given your search results or even your facets, get calculations like the average, the minimum, and the maximum, because sometimes if you're creating like dynamic sliders or things like that for your facets, you can use that pretty effectively by knowing what your upper and lower bounds are, okay? And all of this should be documented there at the end. Just to show you a little bit, this is the Solr tutorial. You can see right off here on the left-hand side, whoops, the various different examples of faceting. And this is actually, we're using some e-commerce data from CNET from way back when, but we've got your basic field facets. You can always query, a facet can always just be a query as well. Here's an example of the range faceting. You see there 0 to 50, 350 to 400, as well as ratings. By date, there's the pivot faceting, and then there's your clustering or your dynamic faceting. So all I did here was check out Solr, build the example, java-jar, start.jar on Solr, and hit the browse URL, and you get this kind of display here, okay? So if you haven't seen that, check that out. Other features that I often come and see, and how many people are doing like multilingual? You have many, many languages for your e-commerce store. So the cool thing I think that's been happening in Solr, and in no small part to Robert Muir and a few other people, is there's been a whole lot more language support added at the tokenization level and the stemming level, things like that. So quite extensive language coverage. I think we cover probably at least, last time I counted, it was north of 20 different languages, all pretty much the most widely spoken languages in the world on down. So obviously English and all the European, French, Spanish, German, things like that, Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, Korean. Now I think we've got things like Armenian and Indic and Hindi and on and on and on. And of course, we also have full Unicode support. I forget the exact version, but I think it's 4.2 at this point. So pretty good coverage of Unicode there. So in other words, what you're doing with language analysis, you should be able to do that. Generally, best practices then, or the question becomes, how do I represent that content in the index? Most people probably just have multiple fields, so that when the user comes in, you have a way of determining what language the user is querying in, and then you go and search against that specific field. And other things I think go in there, synonyms, and then as part of the analysis, that's pretty straightforward. If you're not aware also, and this often comes up with in the e-commerce space with dealing with products, the ability to override stemming or mark a specific token or a set of tokens as not stemmed, you can use that now. You can do that pretty easily in the analysis layer of Lucene and Solr, so that can be effective for making sure that product names aren't stemmed or are treated specially, so that can be useful. And at the end of the day, all of that language analysis stuff is all pluggable, and that's probably one of the most common places that people actually plug in their own analysis capability, or plug in their own, extend Lucene or Solr. So that can be pretty effective as well. How many people just do nightly updates on your index in terms of you get your product dump nightly? Anybody do like actually real-time updates? You know, your business people that can constantly edit and adjust prices. So I think you're starting to see more and more of this in the e-commerce space, that, you know, as you guys have all of your pipelines to your vendors or suppliers or earlier on in your supply chain, that anytime there's things like price updates or description updates, you want to have that live on the site right away. So things like the near real-time stuff, that's all going to make that all that much easier. That being said, I mean, it's pretty easy to be in about the 1 minute range, 5 minute range right now without any changes. Have a number of clients who are in like the 30-second range. And as you heard maybe in the committer panel there when Michael Bush was talking about Twitter, the ability to open up index readers after every commit of a document, that should be in very soon, so, or relatively soon, probably within the year. So being able to do those incremental updates is pretty interesting. What's a little bit harder, and I think the column stride fields help a little bit with this, is that ability to update just one part of a document, incremental field updates. Unfortunately, I can't promise you anytime soon full incremental updates. I can say that we do have kind of a working plan for how to do them, or at least the idea I think has been fleshed out by a number of people in Lucene and Solr as to how to implement that. But if you've dealt with any search engine out there, that's a pretty non-trivial question. And typically, from what I've seen, is the companies that do allow incremental updates, you pay a pretty stiff penalty at indexing time the first time. So even though you get this better structure, or that allows you incremental updates, it comes at a pretty severe penalty, and I don't think we want to pay that penalty. So, but hopefully, I think what we've worked out should allow for no penalty for regular users or for when you're doing batch indexing, as well as give you the updates. And the column stride field should allow you to at least update certain kinds of things in process without having that be too much of a problem. Yeah. The question was, is that a Lucene version number? And actually, so Solr and Lucene version numbers are now the same. So it was that, you know, there was Solr 1.4, and now it's, we just did a release of both Lucene and Solr, and they're both 3.1. So there will be, when we release Lucene 4.0, there will also be Solr 4.0. There are, of course, you know, the near real-time ramifications at the Lucene level are, in some regards, easier than they are at the Solr level because of the caching and all of that stuff. So we have to make sure that all of those layers that are built on top of Lucene in Solr are still effective, right? So, relevance controls, I think this really gets to the part of e-commerce where, you know, you really is about making search most effective in your application and thinking about what tools you can have at your disposal in order to actually manipulate relevance to your benefit, such that you can do those tests, such that you can bring in hopefully more money to your store and more effective searches. One of the primary things that I think maybe is Solr users, I think, use function queries a fair amount. Lucene users, not so much, because Lucene users tend to just build things themselves into Lucene. That being said, function queries are being, the Solr function queries are being currently moved into a module that will make them more accessible to both Lucene users and Solr users. And you should see a lot of iteration there. But essentially what a function query allows you to do is use the value of a field as part of your scoring parameter, okay, or as part of your relevance calculation. So if you have ratings information, for instance, that you store on a field or in an external value source, you can then use that to, you know, multiply that into your scoring or add that into your scoring. So, you know, all else being equal, a higher rated item would show up sooner than, or higher up in the results list than a lower rated item. So you can start to see how you can use function queries to do those kinds of things. I've also seen quite effectively companies use things like their inventory, if they have margin information or profit information, or even just maybe price information via function queries to manipulate the results. That's not a sin in terms of e-commerce. It's your site, it's your search results. You do have the right to do those kinds of things. I think users will, you know, I mean, they recognize that they often want things that are more popular, so you can do that. It's not like, I think, traditional internet search where there's this notion of some ethical behavior by the search engine, hopefully, that you're getting unbiased results. You often see this, I think, on websites where they have sort by, what's like the terms they use, like featured items, you know, and what does featured items mean? Well, I'm sure you all know that that's that company's internal ranking as to what they think is they're going to, you would like, as well as what they probably will make the most money off of. At least, you know, maybe that's my cynical viewpoint. But so here's just it's a shortened URL there, but showing the browse, hitting that same tutorial in Solr, querying for iPod and that BF. That means boost function, and all I'm saying is boost by the price, but you can actually do a lot more extensive function capabilities, doing things like multiply and divide and sum and min-max and various other things, so that you can then, that automatically just gets either, you can have it either added in to the query or multiplied into the query score. So it's something you can play around with in terms of controls. Editorial controls and the horribly named query elevation component. How many people know that thing? Have even heard of the query elevation component? I often see that in e-commerce. You get this request from one of the concerns often with adopting Lucene or Solr in e-commerce is, well, where are my tools to say, you know, I'm going to have a sale this week and I want these items to be at the top of the result list for these specific keywords. And so there's always, because there's no UI that does that, but underneath the hood, the query elevation component enables you to do that. So that you can say, for this specific question or this specific query, here are the results that I want to be at the top. And it has a couple of different options. You can just have it float those results to the top. You can have it return only those results. And then you can also use it for excluding results. So, you know, you always see in e-commerce or in store ads, you know, the fine print says these items are excluded from this sale. So you can use this kind of editorial controls for doing those things. Also could be used for serving up ads that, you know, if you're running specific ads on your site for specific keywords, you could use the editorial controls. I call it editorial boosting, but the real name is the query elevation component because it's elevating the query items, I guess. I didn't name it. But essentially there's an example. If you look in the Solr example configuration, there's a request handler called the Elevate request handler that uses the query elevation search component. You should not have a separate request handler for this necessarily. You can use that search component in your normal request handler. We just do it in the example there so that it's called out and shown separate. But search components are a design that you incorporate them into your main request handler, just like you would with spell checking or any of those. Okay. Landing pages, basically this notion, some sites out there, a lot of sites out there, when a user's typing keywords, you kind of, instead of giving them back search results, you send them to a specific like product page. Sometimes this is done at the application layer, but you can also do this in the search layer, either by having a separate index, kind of a side index where you keep your landing pages, and so you do a search against your main index and your landing pages index. Or you do a search against the landing pages index first, and then if there's a result, then you go to the landing page. If not, you do your search against the main index. You could also, you know, just play some tricks with your query time. If you put them all in together, all those the landing page documents in together, then just have a type field and boost on the landing page token such that your landing page is the first result. That may be just as fast and effective as doing this two query pass thing, even though you're in some regards doing some unnecessary work. It may be easier just to do in your application layer too, but I just at least want it to be known that you can do it. Click scoring, this is in LWE only, but the essentially popularity-based ranking or crowdsourcing your ranking. So instead of you having to guess at what's relevant and having your business users have to guess at what's relevant. You just merely have the system go and you're collecting your clickstream. You're doing it automatically does this clickstream analysis in the background and automatically re-ranks results for queries based on how many user clicks there are on specific items. So if you have some item that's shows up at rank number 10, everybody's clicking on that one. Over time, it will filter up to the top. You can also, it still has like the important thing is if you're going to implement this yourself too, you want to think about having like a jitter component to it or a randomness component where you want to make sure that new content has a chance to be surfaced as well in addition to what's most popular, especially if your products are more timely that way where you're constantly adding new products or manipulating products. So Andrzej Białecki is giving a talk later today on this, so that might be useful. Okay, so just you can go there, and I think he's going to talk about a lot more of the details. So I think, as you can see, you have a pretty complete set of search features that across many e-commerce sites. Obviously, I think Faceting is probably the big one that most people use. I've seen, and maybe this is a good question for the audience as well, is how many people power all the rest of your navigation on your site by your search engine? And effectively like through like the match all docs query and then filters or facets. So there's a few. I mean, I think you're starting to see this more and more, especially as people are going away from the database and just, primarily driving the site off of search. That can be pretty effective. Yeah. So a lot of sites, when you come into them, you hit this landing page and there's some set of products there, right? Well, that can just be a search that, hits the search engine and does like a ** query or a match all docs query. And you return back the results and you still have all your navigators on the left-hand side that are all generated by facets. So essentially that very first page hit is a search. Right, and of course you can do all of your, you can still do all of your ranking of those search results, according to whatever your, whatever your business needs are. So you start to see, I guess saying power all navigation isn't quite the right word, but powering a lot of the main navigation around products, without users ever having to type in searches, I guess is the point, right? And of course, if you're not aware, there are many other things that are already in Lucene and Solr in terms of things like Autosuggest, so you don't have to go build this yourself. If you saw David's talk yesterday about the suggester component with the finite state automaton, now that was a lot of low-level details on it, but the nice thing is you can build some pretty powerful suggesters out of it. And I think one of the interesting things, like I think Amazon does suggestions really well for e-commerce. For instance, not just that they are doing type ahead, but they also can give spell checking suggestions as well while you're typing ahead, as well as doing like infix suggestions. So all of those things should be possible with the suggester component that's in Lucene and Solr as well. So you can build out, I think, a pretty effective Autosuggest. The other piece to say there is Autosuggest will put obviously a lot more of attacks on your search capacity, right? So make sure you're provisioning your system accordingly for Autosuggest. I think I saw at one point, anyways, in talking to Netflix, that they had Walter Underwood had done a talk and said like that was up to sometimes 10x their query volume or something like that. Now I don't know if that's the case anymore, and it may be that you can put a caching layer in between there as well. So spell checking, did you mean? And basically what you're trying to get at here, is there anything else that you can do for the user to guide them better, to get over the fact that users don't type very well. They make a lot of spelling mistakes. They don't know how to fully express their queries. I mean, I think we all know most times users just expect, they type in a couple of keywords and they want all the best results. So what else can you do to enable them to do that? And since you guys know your domain best and you know the data, start to think about some of these other tools and how they can be used effectively in that place. Last but not least, the spatial one. If you're doing local search, or if you want to do product lookups as to where, is this thing actually in a store, the spatial search can be a nice component there. Have full support for bounding box as well as straight on distance or radial search, stuff like that. Just finishing up a few other complementary tools. I'm one of the founders of the Mahout project, so it's kind of my baby, so I always like to promote it no matter what. But recommendation systems, you don't have to build this yourself anymore. Mahout has a very mature recommender. We just did the KDD Cup, just put out a music recommendations challenge, and Mahout out of the box with very minimal tweaks was in 4th place on the first day just by doing nothing, just importing the code, importing the data set, and running the tests, and we were in 4th place. We have many of the components that were used by the researchers who won the Netflix prize. Many of those are available in open source in Mahout. Very scalable as well, can have a Hadoop component to it that allows you to do offline calculations, so by all means check that out. I've done some, I use the word crude, and that's really what it is. I've done some hacking of a recommendation component that hooks into Solr, such that when a query comes in, it gets back the doc IDs. It takes those doc IDs, like your top 10, hits the Mahout recommender and says, essentially people who like this product also like that product, like doing an item-to-item recommendation. So I won't claim it's production ready or anything like that, but if it at least inspires you to think about how that could be used, then by all means. Downstream classifiers clustering around user analysis, content analysis. This gets back to kind of doing some of these harder things that people are doing as opposed to the Autosuggest piece. So that can be, Mahout has a lot of capabilities for doing massive online analysis or massive analysis of what's happening in your system. You can also white label ratings and reviews from like Bazaar Voice, companies like that might be useful in your system. Not trying to plug them in particular, but I've seen them used pretty effectively across a lot of e-commerce stores. And then, the business rules side, I don't have a whole lot there, but that can be something you might want to think about how that can interact with your system. What's missing? Essentially what's missing, I think, from a lot of businesses' perspective, especially the business user perspective, is this kind of UI layer that allows you as the engineers to hand off all of these kind of tweaks, so that you don't have to go in and code. I think, LWE, we try to give you some more of these tools, and I've seen a lot of businesses build their own tool set, or they hook things into their existing tool chains, or if you already have Omniture or Google Analytics and those things in place, it's not as big a deal. But think about different ways. Essentially, think about you probably will have to build UI components that do some of these things. In particular, I think one of the most commonly asked for one is facet management tools, the ability to do things like apply labels more easily, be able to sort by things other than count or alphabetical order. I think there's a few JIRA issues open on that one. I haven't seen a good patch on it yet, though. As well as being able to essentially do editorial controls on facets as well. So. What's next? I do have a blog post on some of these ideas. They've been up for a while. And there's actually some more sample code and sample data that kind of show out these different things. So that might be something of use. Last but not least, some other resources. So I think I got time for a couple of questions, maybe, if you want to use the microphone. Otherwise, talk really loud.
Hi. For the last 4 years, I worked for a bank, and it was all big scale. And now I'm just moved to a startup, so it's small scale and open source, and most of this is relatively new to me.
Okay.
So I have two related questions. At what point should we move from Solr installed on 1, 2, 3 machines to moving to the cloud? And related to this, when we do log analysis, at what point should we move from databases to something like Hadoop?
Yeah, I mean, those are all good questions. So when you should move to the cloud, I mean that's kind of your infrastructure question, right? Is what does it give you over maintaining all of those things yourselves on your internal data centers, right? I mean, Solr and LWE and Lucene all play fine in the cloud. I mean, we have a lot of customers who run on Amazon or various other providers. So, but in terms of scaling, like how many documents do you have in the system?
Let's say that we have in the order of gigabytes, so we can use just one machine to do the searching.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in that case, if it all fits on one index, the nice thing about being in the cloud is you can just, at Christmas time or holiday time, you can bring up, just bring up instances for that time period. And so that can be useful to have that kind of infrastructure in place. I also do see sometimes what people do is they'll have their local data centers, but then they'll also have Amazon as backups. With the recent Amazon outage, it's obviously important that you also make sure you're not all in the same region and have all of that stuff. But
if you're a search engine and you want to retrieve, to give the results in half a second or 200 milliseconds, can you do that from the cloud?
Yeah.
Rely on Amazon to be up?
Yeah, I think I've seen people do that pretty effectively. I mean, part of it is choosing the right instance on Amazon and make sure you have enough memory and all of that stuff for it. But I mean, I think that's definitely doable. All right, thank you. Appreciate you coming and enjoy the rest of the conference.